If somebody were to ask me what countries have the highest percentage of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I would guess Tonga and Samoa, and those are the two countries with the highest percentage. But I wouldn't have thought of Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, or the Federated States of Micronesia, all of which are in the top 10 countries with the highest percentage of Latter-day Saints. When we think of church history, we often think about Palmyra, Kirtland, and Nauvoo, and those are all obviously important. In addition, we need to remember that church history is still being made all around the world, including on the islands of the sea. Recently, Devan Jensen, executive editor of the BYU Religious Studies Center, co-edited a book on the history of the church in Micronesia, which includes several inspirational stories from pioneers in this part of the world.
Ori was sitting there waving and smiling. He explained his boat was not working, and he knew Cannon would find his way to reach him. And so President Cannon said, I had not understood his living constraints. He was happy to see me and eager to support the missionaries. His faith appeared to be greater than mine. So to me, that was just a symbol of the island faith.
Speaking of Jensen's new book, Eric Shumway, former president of BYU Hawaii, said, it would be difficult to overstate the importance of this book of church history. In this episode of Why Religion, Devan Jensen shares insights from his research that can strengthen our faith in Jesus Christ. I'm your host, Professor John Hilton, and this is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why this study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, Why Religion's Casey Griffiths sat down with Devan Jensen, executive editor of the BYU Religious Studies Center, to discuss his research on the history of the church in Micronesia. In part one, we get an overview of how the church took root in Micronesia and learn the stories of early church pioneers in this part of the world. Here's Casey Griffiths interviewing Devan Jensen.
Hello, this is Casey Griffiths. I'm here with Devan Jensen. And Devan, we're talking about your new book, Battlefields to Temple Grounds, Latter-day Saints in Guam and Micronesia. I'm going to start with the most basic question that I think a lot of our listeners might not know, which is, where is Micronesia and how do you distinguish that? Sometimes when we talk about the Pacific, it's Polynesia and we're referring to everything, but the area has culture regions that are very, very different from one another. Can you walk us through, just give us an overview of this area?
It's great to be on with you today. So Micronesia literally means small islands, and it is that small island area that is just north of Melanesia, which is the Black Islands, and then you have Polynesia, which are many islands. It's that area kind of to the west and a little bit to the north. If you were to take from the Philippines to Hawaii, it's that area right in between there. Lesser known, but really important strategically.
And what are some of the countries found in Micronesia?
Yes, we have east to west. We have the Gilbert Islands or Kiribati. Then we have the Marshall Islands. And then we have the Mariana Islands. And then we have the Eastern Carolina Islands, which spread actually quite far east and west, kind of depending on where you want to locate those. So those are the major island groups.
And as I understand it, church growth in Micronesia has been pretty robust over the last little while.
Yes. In fact, if you were to look at percentage-wise, the population, we have 3 of the top 10 nations of the world by Latter-day Saint population in that area. We have Kiribati, or the Gilbert Islands, which is about 18%. And then you have the Marshall Islands, about 9%. And then you have the Federated States of Micronesia, about 6%. So for the gospel message arriving fairly recently, it has really taken root and sprung up quickly, maybe like a coconut tree.
And when you say fairly recently, when did Latter-day Saints start to teach in these islands? When did the church started to be set up among the peoples of Micronesia?
Wonderful. So World War II was really the start of this for some of the islands. For others, it came later than that. So we're talking relatively recently in Earth's history. So World War II, we had the outbreak of the Pacific War, and Guam was a very important strategic location. The Japanese took it from the United States. The United States reclaimed it. And so at that time, there were just individual groups of servicemen out there, but they began to establish small twigs or branches. They were called servicemen's groups. And so they were smaller than our traditional branches, but they began to spring up in places like Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands area. And then you had some in the Gilbert Islands, you had some in Guam. And so these little areas, these servicemen's groups began to spring up. And then eventually in the 1950s really is when they started sending missionaries more regularly. They began to establish formal servicemen's groups and then eventually branches. And they use these old Quonset huts that you've seen, these half dome buildings, and they turn them into Latter-day Saint meeting houses. And so that was the start there.
So the battlefields part of the title here probably comes from the fact that a lot of the names you've been putting out here, Kwajalein, Tarawa, Guam, were battlefields during the Pacific War, World War II.
Absolutely.
And the first inroads to the gospel you mentioned here are American servicemen who were serving the Pacific. There's some famous names here like Elton Perry or Neil A. Maxwell, who were Pacific War veterans.
Yes, Boyd K. Packer as
Boyd
well.
K. Packer. Mm-hmm. These individuals who, come to fight a war, but bring a message of peace along with them as well. There's kind of a paradox there, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because if there's two things I want readers to know about this book is, number one, we're talking about the Pacific War and how these islands in Micronesia were strategic battlefields for both the Japanese and the American forces. And of course, that was a horrendous time. And I just want to underscore how terrible war is. But then the wonderful thing about this is this, if there's a silver lining to the dark clouds of war, it is that missionaries began to arrive, and that in those moments of war, there were the seeds of some peace and better times ahead. And that's the transition to the temple grounds that we have today. When Pearl Harbor happened, then everything changed, and the U.S. War machine got started. So that's the start of the Latter-day Saint presence. As individual groups came out there, they began to form these little pockets of worshipers. There's a story in the book about taking these bullet cases, but they would use those as sacrament cups.
Yeah.
And then they carved out a little wooden tray, and then eventually they could taste a little of that metal. So they had them silver plated. So it's a great scene. But you think about beating your spears into plowshares and turning war, instruments of war, into peace. That's what we're talking about, this transition from war to peace.
So battlefields to temple grounds, and now you're giving us a picture. I want to talk a little bit about the book, because you are the co-editor along with Rosalind Meno Ram. Did I say all that right?
Yes, Meno.
And I've met her, and she's wonderful. Tell us a little bit about you, why you wanted to do this, about Rosalind, how she got involved, and what the origins of this project were.
Absolutely. So thank you for asking that, because this is a project that grew out of love for my fellow Latter-day Saints in Guam and Micronesia. I was a missionary there, And some years ago, it's been 3 decades now, I basically said, I really love this area, but it's really confusing to understand the history of all these islands. And also the U.S. presence and the Japanese presence and the Spanish presence, because in those areas, you're meeting people with Spanish last names, you're meeting people with Japanese last names, and of course, U.S. last names, and then all of the local islands have their own flavors of things. And there are fun U.S. names that have been translated into the, like happiness. That's one of my good friends out there. Right on New Year, great leader of the church in Chuk. And so all these names, they kind of have this blending of the local cultures. So I said, I'm really interested in finding out more. So I applied for a grant from the Religious Studies Center, and they kindly offered me some money to travel out to Chuk and Taiwan and also Guam. And so I kind of made that a great big trip. And I said to John Tanner, president of BYU Hawaii, I said, I'm really trying to write this, but I need some specialists. And he said, you need to talk with Rose Ram from my office. She was an associate academic vice president there. I think I got the title right. And she is a former librarian who used to catalog Pacific materials. And she wrote her dissertation on Chamorro women, the women of Guam, and how they raise their family. And so if there's anyone on the planet who's qualified to talk about the cultures of Micronesia, she is one of those people. So I contacted her. She was very busy, but she said, this is a project I need to be involved in. So about a year later, we got really serious about this. Then we brought in Philip MacArthur, who's a cultural anthropologist who served his mission in the Marshall Islands and really knows and loves the Marshallese people. So we had those three as kind of our core team. Then we reached out to you because you had traveled to Kiribati and said, oh, you know the church educational system, you know the story really well. And so it kept growing and including others. Now, Dan McClellan was one who was a little bit of a long shot because you think, well, he didn't serve a mission there, but he really has traveled to Kosrae several times and as a scripture translation coordinator. And then we had local missionaries, like Harriana Nepo Hinton. So we ended up with quite a few really good local experts who knew the stuff, and then there were several who got up to speed and could really talk about it well. And so that became our team. And we joked at one event that this is like the Avengers. We had these really diverse, talented people assembled from all over with their superpowers of writing and research, and as a result, feel really good about it, including some of the members who have lived on some of the islands for many years, for many decades. And so this became our core team.
And I appreciate your perspective on that, because one point of criticism could be, you're an American guy who lives in Orem, Utah. What right do you have to tell the story about Micronesia? So tell us why you felt like it was important to assemble kind of this diverse team of authors in order to cover the story and give it the best possible grounded perspective.
Casey, I'm so glad you said that, because we're aware of how this history of colonialism is so strong in this area. I mean, there's so many European nations who have controlled this area. And so we said, at the beginning, we have to make sure we have women and men in more of a balance than traditionally is in some publications, because that's the way the scholarship is going. Have a blend of voices. We need to have indigenous and European and Asian voices as well. And so we tried to balance these voices, and then we tried to say, okay, let's do interviews with the people so that their voice comes through very strongly. So we have some of the leaders on Chuk, we have some of the leaders on Pohnpei, some of the indigenous leaders in Guam as well, the Chamorro people. And so all together, we feel like, in fact, if I can share, we feel like it came together well. Eric Shumway, the former president of BYU Hawaii, made a comment. He said, I love this book. I love the way the authors give voice to hundreds of Micronesians whose faith and courage in many ways match those of other generations of Latter-day Saints. And then he basically says, look at the way that this talks about these cultural differences, multiple languages, persecution, apostasy, and the legacy of colonialism and horrifying war. It would be difficult to overstate the importance of this book of church history. Basically, we tried to kind of say, yes, we respect your cultures, we listen to you, and yet we're coming from a written culture and a research culture, and so we're going to gather these oral traditions and these oral cultures and try to preserve them in a way that will last to the next generations. And so that was our goal in assembling this team.
Yeah, and I've got to credit you for the great job you did. For instance, for my chapter, I'm also an American guy from Saratoga Springs, Utah. But you strongly encouraged me, and I took a research assistant with me, Eric Tonini, who spoke the language. But the author of my chapter is Yotua Tune, who's one of the earliest members of the church in Kiribati. And we really went out of the way to sit down, listen to him, listen to his story, and make sure that when we wrote the chapter, and this is under your encouragement, that it wasn't just the story of this missionary came. It was the story of here's what the people who joined the church did and how they built this wonderful, beautiful faith community that incorporates elements of their own culture from the ground up, basically. So it's really a model for what international Latter-day Saint history can look like, because it gets past this general authority visited, and this was the first missionary, to more, here's the local membership of the church and what they did and what's unique and beautiful about them and how they built the church here. So credit to your leadership.
Thank you. And I will add here that Rose does a wonderful job sharing her story growing up in Guam, and talks about it like the tide pools of Guam and what it was like as a member to leave Guam and go to Hawaii, well, to Arizona first, and then to Hawaii, and then to come back and kind of just have this global experience. And so hers is one of those amazing, again, female converts and very professional. All the things that she brings to the table in terms of her experience, her life experience, and her research background. So that's one of the example of a story that's very powerful there. Another one that is very powerful is that of Memnet Lopez, who served on the Relief Society Advisory Board and just was very involved in the Philippines and Guam, and the U.S. and Utah as well. Those are two examples of the amazing stories of local members who have these really interesting, rich engagements with the wider world, and then come back as the local leaders. So Memnet Lopez became one of the temple leadership, the matron of the Jigo Guam Temple that is established there now. And so two highlights of the book that I think I want to just bring out. I
want to highlight Rose Ram, who I met a couple months ago, and her commitment to this is incredible, but also her commitment to the church. You and I came to BYU Hawaii, and there was a big conference going there, partly to celebrate the book. And, a lot of people have gathered. And I remember Rose saying to us, I'm not going to be at the conference. And I was like, oh my gosh, are you sick or something? She's like, no, I got a shift in the temple.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, you guys are holding a big conference, but I'm going to go do stuff that actually matters in the temple. Was kind of Rose's feel. Like,
I love it. That is 100% how she's so committed, and I will do my duty. And it was great to have her be part of this. And I will add that this project is ongoing in the sense that there is a new book being proposed to the Religious Studies Center on women's voices in the Pacific and Asia. And so I think that she will continue to have a strong voice in the scholarship of the Pacific, and particularly women's studies. It's a very important project to continue.
Can you give us a quick summary of how we went from battlefields to temple grounds? Why there's been such a significant change in Micronesia?
Absolutely. So this really took off in the 1970s. In 1976, Elder John Groberg was the area supervisor, and he met with the mission president in Hawaii and said, we need to send missionaries throughout all these countries. And so they did. They sent missionaries throughout the countries. And then what happened is island by island, it started to take off. So in Kiribati, it got connected with church schools. In Pohnpei, they latched onto the gospel message. And so in Chuuk, they quickly grabbed onto the message. So it was kind of like a seed that sprung up like a coconut tree and grew into a branch quickly, and then developed into a district, and then later a stake. And so we see this transition from these former World War II Pacific battlegrounds into a place where temples can be built in a relatively short period of time. And I think a factor in that, quite honestly, is people already had faith in Jesus Christ, and they were looking for other opportunities to exercise their faith. And this was an exciting opportunity for them to learn about the gospel and to grab onto this message of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ.
So Micronesia is a good kind of microcosm of the church. How you go from having no members to small branches to wards to stakes. And I guess the final stage of development that we're literally seeing happening before our eyes right now is temples. You mentioned a temple in Guam. And what other places are temples coming into this area?
So we have the temple in Guam, and then we have a temple in Kiribati, which is going to be right across from the Capitol buildings in Kiribati, so the government buildings there. So those are two locations, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's another one within the next 20 years. And I think that the reason that seems likely to me is because the Federated States of Micronesia is a whole different country from Guam. And so we sometimes group these together, but they have different needs out in that country. So when we talk about Micronesia, it is a lot of countries. It's like Polynesia. There's many nations scattered out through Micronesia.
So that's the big picture of story. But really, when we're talking about the growth of church, we're talking about individuals and families. Are there any stories that spring to mind that kind of capture the miracle that's happened here in Micronesia?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I'm going to focus a little bit on the island I served on, Pohnpei, because that's where things got hopping. So in the summer of 1973, there were two Pingalapese school teachers from the island of Pohnpei. Now, Pingalap is a small atoll on the outside of Pohnpei, and they were selected by the Department of Education to go to Hawaii to become school teachers. So they went to BYU Hawaii and were studying to be school teachers, and they met the missionaries there. And as a result of that, they were interested in the gospel. And Oren Ori said, "I will join the church if you will send missionaries to my island." And so really, the gospel seed got planted with that one convert. Now, what's fun about that is he joined the church, and they said, "Okay, we'll come visit you." And so they sent him a letter, and you have to understand how hard it is to communicate across these islands. And so they said, "Here's the date, we'll be there." So the mission president, President Cannon, arrived on this date, October 9th, 1976, and he arrived there. And nobody was there at the airport. And by the way, the airport was just literally poles and plywood on top. So it was very, very basic. So he arrived there and said, where can I find this guy? And he says, "Oh yeah, I've heard of him." So they went to and so they went kind of all around the island. They traveled clear around the other side of the island. And this is a long ride by Jeep or whatever, rutted roads. They got around there to this town called Mand, and Ori was sitting there waving and smiling. He explained his boat was not working, and he knew Cannon would find his way to reach him. And so President Cannon said, "I had not understood his living constraints. He was happy to see me and eager to support the missionaries. His faith appeared to be greater than mine." So to me, that was just a symbol of the island faith. They know that things are not going to work out with their boat, but they know the Lord will take care of them. And so this was an example of that strong faith that he had, that somehow the Lord would provide a way.
Wow, amazing. What other stories stand out to you from this wonderful collection you put together?
Great. I'm going to share another one. This is from Jingle and Jackie Hamon. And I think his name is fun because it's spelled almost like Jingle Bells, but it's got a K in the middle of it. And so Jingle was smoking 2 packs of cigarettes daily, drinking alcohol each night. And so Jingle and Jackie got married, and they met the missionaries. And the missionaries kind of tracked them down and followed them from one place to another, and it was very surprising to them that they found them, and you'll have to read the book to get the full story. But basically, when he joined, he ended up joining the church. And so he was called as a district president within a very short time after joining the church. And so district president obviously is involving a supervision of all of the branches. And so then when he was leading the church, he said, the mission president, Gary Marshall, said, I want you to take this church handbook and learn it like your scriptures. And so he would carry around the church handbook and his scriptures everywhere he went, and he wore out his cover. He just used it so much. So basically, he would go around trying to strengthen the branches, and literally, in some cases, just walking around the island to try to meet the different branches and branch presidents and strengthen them, teach them. So then he ended up getting a heart attack pretty soon afterward. And he said, "Why am I getting these challenges? I'm still trying to, to really learn my role as a district president." And that scripture in 1 Nephi 3:7 came to mind. He says, "To go into the things the Lord that Heavenly Father has commanded you to do." And so he said, "I stopped complaining, went to the mission president, said, 'Help me. I want to magnify my calling.'" And so that's when he really said, "I want you to just focus on this handbook, and you're going to learn everything you need to learn there in the scriptures." And so basically, Jackie and Jingle together helped that small district make major strides to becoming a stake. And so he actually ended up moving to Utah later, and he just lives a few blocks away from me. And so it's fun to see this full circle. Here's a gentleman a family who joined the church in Pohnpei, and then they moved to Orem a few blocks away, and so they've become dear friends.
To me, it's always been amazing the parallels between what the early church was like and what the developing church is in places like these areas that we're describing here. I have a friend, Tonalyn Ford, who likes to say, it's always 1830 in the church somewhere. And stories like that, where a brand new convert to the church is expected to run a branch and know all the operations of the church and bring everybody together, just kind of show how that era of high adventure and the sort of things we saw in the early restoration are still going on around the world today. It's just the stage has shifted from places like Palmyra and Ohio to places like Guam or Kiribati. It just is wonderful to know that there's still these incredible miracles of faith and sacrifice. And holy cow, what a big sacrifice.
And going right along with that, we've titled some of our chapters Pioneers in Pohnpei, Pioneers in Palau, because these are the first generation pioneers who are making a difference in the church in this area. And most of them are still alive. Well, some of them are still alive. And we wanted to capture some of their stories to make sure we retain these pioneering members' conversion stories and how they navigated the challenges of church membership and then passed along those seeds of faith to the next generation. One of the other interesting stories that I want to share is from Philip MacArthur. He shares the story of how in the Marshall Islands, there were interesting hierarchies that the missionaries weren't always aware of. So, for example, there was a President Lonnie, who was supposed to be laying hands on one of the Relief Society sisters to set her apart as the Relief Society president. Mm-hmm. And he could not bring himself to do it. And it was just awkward because everybody was watching, including Philip. He was watching as this local leader was being asked to set his hands on. And what he didn't understand is that she was the Relief Society president was of a higher caste, higher class. It was taboo for him to place his hands on the head of this Relief Society president who was waiting to be set apart. And so it just paused and paused. And finally, the mission president said, would it be okay if I did it this time? And so everybody in the congregation was so relieved because they knew that this local Marshallese member could not touch this other lady's head. But the mission president could because he was an outsider. He was an American, and the same rules did not apply. So that's another interesting story, that there's these cultural taboos that we are unaware of that are very important. Basically, that's one of our goals in the book, is to talk about, hey, we have these waves of American culture and these waves of indigenous culture that are sometimes bumping into each other and creating interesting conflicts, but we're working through them to try to understand how to get along well. And so that's a major theme of the book, is intercultural cooperation and how these waves intersect.
What other stories stuck out to you as you studied this area of the world and these saints?
Well, I want to just point out that many members of the church who are from these islands have immigrated to the U.S. as well. Mm-hmm. And so while we're talking about the saints in Micronesia, we're also talking about the saints from Micronesia who are part of the U.S. as well. There are thousands, in fact, tens of thousands of Micronesians in the United States. And there are lots of congregations. There's a new branch in Clearfield, for example, of Micronesians. There are Marshallese branches in Utah. There are folks in Missouri, Arkansas, lots of states. And so I want to just note that there's a diaspora, or a scattering of saints throughout the world.
If you're interested in more peer-reviewed, high-quality gospel scholarship about Latter-day Saint history, doctrine, or practice, such as this publication, BYU's Religious Studies Center is a great place to check out. The RSC has recently published a new book called Religious Liberty and Latter-day Saints: Historical and Global Perspectives, edited by John C. Thomas and Robert T. Smith. The history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints amply illustrates the challenge its members have faced to freely exercise their deeply held religious convictions, even when those convictions were condemned by law. This volume offers historical and global perspectives on how the Latter-day Saints' understanding of religious freedom has been forged through the crucible of their experiences, and provides insights into the opportunities and challenges that may lie ahead. Again, the book is called Religious Liberty and Latter-day Saints: Historical and Global Perspectives. Check it out and pick it up at rsc.byu.edu. We've been listening to Devan Jensen share insights on the history of the church in Micronesia. In part 2, Casey and Devan discuss new temples in this part of the world, as well as approaches to sharing the gospel that have been particularly effective.
Now, as the church has grown and matured in Micronesia, one of the signs of a maturing church is temples and availability of temples. I know that one of the motivations to publish this book and the timing was the dedication of the Yigo Guam temple. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us some stories related to these temples, where they're located, and how they're coming into the picture? Because we've got Yigo Guam, mm-hmm. we've got temple in Tarawak, Kiribati, mm-hmm. Vanuatu. Tell us a little bit about these temples.
I'm just going to point out that many people were looking forward to a temple for decades. So Elder Bill Davis is one of the Area 70s from that area Authority 70s from that area for many years, who was encouraging people. And I mention him only as the last of many who worked for many years to work toward a temple. They'd have drives to try to help teach about the church, to bring missionary work to the forefront, and also to just basically have people understand the message of the gospel in Guam, and to increase the local tithe paying and everything, so that they would meet those key qualifying standards to have a temple there. So when the temple was announced, the Lopezes, for example, Memnon and Marlo Lopez, were in Salt Lake City, and they were just overjoyed. And then they got the call from President Eyring to serve as the temple president and matron. And so they said they had no concept that they'd be returning to Guam, and yet now they're there. They were part of that dedication, and again, they brought in many local Chamorro leaders, and the whole island rejoiced. Now, this came during COVID, so it was a very complicated time because people couldn't travel from island to island in many cases, but they were able to broadcast that to a lot of the members so they could watch that as well. And then, interestingly enough, they had a terrible typhoon that affected a lot of the island and caused some water damage in Guam. So in the Jigo Guam temple. So even as hard as they've worked to get the temple, they are still affected by those typhoons, and they have had some serious typhoons over the years. With the Tarawa Kiribati temple, that is going to be close to the government center. And so that is an exciting thing because it's a little bit like the Washington, D.C. temple, where it's on the outskirts of this area that is so critical to our nation. And so to imagine having the Kiribati temple close to the Kiribati government center.
The main island of Kiribati is Tarawa, which is about 40 miles long and I think 800 meters wide at its widest point. I'm mixing English and metric measurements here. But the House of Parliament is going to be across the street from the temple. It'd be the equivalent of if the Washington, D.C. temple was right across from the U.S. Capitol.
Yes.
And I've got to imagine that will seriously increase the visibility of the church in Kiribati, which it's already pretty visible. Now, another aspect of this story is education and how education opens the door for the gospel, but opens the door for opportunities. One thing I noticed when I was in Kiribati was that you could tell what school the kids went to by the color of shirt that they wore. There were, blue kids from the Protestant school and kids wearing red shirts from the Catholic school, and the Latter-day Saint kids wore green shirts and everything like that. Can you talk a little bit about education and the role it's played in helping the church grow in this part of the world?
I just love how the church school in Tonga became the method for these members in Kiribati to latch onto and really get excited about the gospel. They joined the church there and then took the gospel message back to Kiribati and became the pioneering members. So that's another great example, a great story of faith, and how in one generation you have a massive conversion of several key members who became the pioneering members for the next generation.
Yeah, and just to quickly summarize, Kiribati is one of these countries that has one of the largest percentage of church members right now. And the reason why the gospel was able to go to Kiribati, which was very difficult, is my understanding, was because of education. This school teacher wrote and asked if a group of his students could go to Liahona High School. They attended for 1 year, in which they all converted to the church, and then they became the first missionaries. And eventually, the church built its own school in Kiribati, and that school is it's the heart of the church in Kiribati. It's made me wonder, in this era when traditional missionary work is struggling, if we maybe could shift tactics and focus on an educational-based model or things like that, where people have the opportunity to see the church contributing to their communities, and that is how we open the door for missionary work, because it feels like the methods we have been using for the last little while have been harder to implement, and it might help if we framed ourselves as community builders and not just people that are interested in increasing the size of their congregations.
I think it's very insightful because in the islands, the Pacific Islands in particular, education is the key to the future. Mm-hmm. And the places where they have schools, such as the Catholic and the Seventh-day Adventist and the Protestant schools, are tremendously impactful to the community, and everywhere a Latter-day Saint educational opportunity exists, it has a major impact on the community in terms of benefiting and blessing the community, and also in terms of strengthening the local congregations to the point where they become major hubs and exporters of converts.
Yeah, and I think there's innovative ways we could do this. When I visited Kiribati, for instance, I went to the Institute of Religion, and there were students there, reading scriptures, but Kiribati is a place where educational opportunity is extremely limited. And I saw a young lady who was using the internet at the Institute to take an accounting class through the Pathways program. And so I think the church has already taken a few of those steps, but I wonder if that's not the future of missionary work, that we build community and that draws people to us, because in Kiribati, that's certainly been a boon. Like the members, the students, I think I witnessed 6 baptisms, and I was there for 5 days, and they all took place at the school, and almost everybody that was getting baptized had done so because they were attending the school, or they were so impressed with the school, or they saw how the school had helped their island. It was just a really, really great example of maybe a different type of missionary work. And it's interesting that in our history, Leonard Arrington once talked about this kind of center bias, where we think that everything that's good in the church comes at church headquarters and then spreads throughout the church, when in reality, a lot of times we can learn a lot from these outer parts of the church and bring the good things that they do into the center and make the whole culture a little bit better. Because there's so much to admire about Micronesian culture. It's just really, really great in so many ways.
Yeah, Philip MacArthur said in the book something along these lines. He said, to the degree that the missionaries were able to separate their own Wasatch Front culture from the actual teachings of the church, they tended to have more success with the local members. And it's really complicated to do that because you have lots of layers of culture, in terms of how you do things. So we would also say, perhaps in reverse, if we could learn from the cultures of Micronesia and import some of those things to the U.S. and say, wow, that is a powerful teaching. What they're teaching me, I want to use that in my family. That cross-cultural influence.
Yeah. They influence us, we influence them. And in the middle, I love this phrase that President Oaks introduced. There's a gospel culture created that kind of is the best of all things, where we sort of sift out the negative and celebrate the positive that really does lead to happiness and joy and connectivity.
If you're interested in reading Battlefields to Temple Grounds, Latter-day Saints in Guam and Micronesia, we've provided a link to the book in the episode notes and on our website at whyreligion.byu.edu. There, you can also learn more about Devan Jensen, his training, and his other publications. We've also included a link where you can download for free his article, 30 Years of Pioneers on Pohnpei, Micronesia. Okay, we've arrived at our last segment, part 3, where we like to discuss things more personally. Here, Devan talks about the balance between study and faith and how they are mutually reinforcing.
Devan, you've done a wonderful job. Normally, in the final part of our program, we just turn the focus on you a little bit. And I want to talk to you about your balance between study and faith, and how you keep them in balance, and how your study has helped your faith and vice versa.
Good. Well, thank you for asking that, Casey. That's a very deeply personal question. And so when I have studied the culture and history of not only Micronesia, but also more generally the United States, what I find myself enriched by is the number of people and how people deal with the challenges in front of us. And it is I'm coming from an English background, right? English humanities background. And so I always love the stories of people, and to capture those oral history cultures and preserve them is really important to me. So I'll give you some examples from my own family. So when I've studied, for example, Philo Dibble is one of my ancestors. Mm-hmm. I've learned more about his faith and his experiences with Joseph and the vision, for example, and how he wanted to preserve those things. I've learned more about the stories of some of my ancestors who were in the Utah War and how those complicated situations of strife in early Utah territory translated into the lives of ordinary members. And so I hope that helps you kind of get a feel for how I've translated not only the Western history, but also the Pacific culture, and learned some things that have enriched my faith and my family stories.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed you even have a little tag you put at the bottom of your email. You have a little graphic that says Devan Jensen, storyteller.
Yes, exactly.
What are some of the most important stories to you when it comes to your faith?
Oh, great question. When it comes to me, I think I'm going to return to church history because of this philo-dibble connection. So a story that I shared in my recent past is philo-dibble as a guy who brought artists to Nauvoo and said, I want you to show Joseph Smith's martyrdom. I want you to show him as a leader in the Nauvoo Legion. And because he captured those things, those are stories that are preserved in art. Had he not done that, it would have been many, many years. So he influenced C.C.A. Christensen as an artist, one of our early Latter-day Saint, probably our most prolific 19th century artists. Mm-hmm. And because of that, we have some tangible records that we otherwise would not have. So that's an example of faith that lives on and resonates with me.
Mm-hmm. Well, Devan, thank you so much for your good work. The book is called Battlefields to Temple Grounds, Latter-day Saints in Guam and Micronesia, edited by R. Devan Jensen and Rosalind Meno Ram. So thank you for all the work you're doing to bring this to light, and best of luck in future endeavors.
Thank you, Casey.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of Religious Education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is John Hilton, the host and producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes from BYU Religious Education, Professors Jenna Erickson, Casey Griffiths, Jared Halverson, Travis Searle, Ryan Sharp, Hank Smith, and Brad Wilcox. Recording, mixing, and original music was done by BYU student Alec Galloway. Say hi, Alec.
Hi, guys.
Original music and scoring for the Why Religion podcast was also created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion and leave us a rating. It really helps others discover this podcast. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by BYU religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith in Jesus Christ.